The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Tonight we have a special treat, a recorded interview with two students from Southern University Law Center, and they'll be sharing their research into medical care of inmates and mentally ill patients in Louisiana. So, let's get to it. Okay, with me tonight are two young gentlemen from Southern University Law Center, Cameron Pontiff and Hayden Carlos. And I encountered these gentlemen when they were giving a presentation at Southern University Law Center at the Roots Camp, Louisiana, which is an annual gathering, as I understand it, of progressive activists. And Cameron and Hayden were giving a presentation on the mental health care system in America and how it is not designed to protect the mentally ill very well. And I guess that you also included the criminal justice system too, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, just by introduction here, Cameron Pontiff is a second-year law student at Southern University Law Center from Lafayette, Louisiana. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette in 2017. He is a published editor for Southern University's Journal of Race, Gender, and Poverty, and is also an active member of SULC's Moot Court Board. And I want to talk more about the Moot Court just briefly. But Hayden Carlos is a second-year law student at Southern University Law Center who is originally from Lafayette, Louisiana. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette in 2017. He is also a published editor for the Southern University Law Review and is also an active member of the Southern University Law Center's Moot Court Board. So, everyone listening is dying to know what a moot court is. Can you give us some kind of brief explanation of moot court?
Yeah, sure. So moot court is basically a mock Supreme Court oral argument. You're given a record of different issues, and you have to argue both sides. You have to argue for the government and for the individual. So basically, you're going before the court and discussing a legal issue. We went to a moot court competition recently. We were discussing the constitutional issues with Minnesota's civil commitment scheme of sex offenders and how it possibly violated substantive due process. So basically, you just go before a panel and give an argument, and they are questioning you throughout the whole entire argument. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'll bet. So you're arguing with a judge, basically, or a panel?
Essentially.
Okay, kind of like the Supreme Court or in a higher court.
Exactly.
You're just there making your argument. That sounds good. And you're both interested in going into civil rights litigation, or I know one of you. Yeah, both Cameron and Hayden intend to practice civil rights litigation. Yes, there you are. So that's basically what you would be doing, is arguing cases, not so much in front of a jury as like a criminal case, but the civil rights cases. You'd be arguing law, correct?
But they would go first in front of a trial, and then we would go up to the appellate level, but primarily, yes.
Okay, sure. Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, one of the cases that I've covered, it may not be this one here, it did go before a jury. Anyway, also, too, the major thrust of your presentation at Southern was for the benefit of activists. But for the benefit of the listeners here, I'm interested to find out what you guys learned on this topic. And you were focusing on, like I said, the treatment of mentally ill people, basically, both in our criminal justice system and our mental treatment system. And for your research, you chose the injustices inflicted upon a man named Lehman Howard, correct?
Correct, yes.
And who was Lehman Howard, and why do you think it's important to publicize this man's life?
Well, Lehman was an interesting man. It was hard to find information on him because he spent most of his life, over 40 years, in some kind of institution, whether it was a prison or a mental health institution.
So he sounds like a really bad guy, really.
Well, he wasn't, as far as we know. He was initially brought to a mental health institute when he was 19 years old. He was the son of a sharecropper who's a poor young black man in a generally poor majority black area called Frierson, south of Shreveport.
Okay.
And while he was there, he was charged with the murder of a rich white woman named Mary Booth, who lived in Shreveport. That murder had gone unsolved for about 2 years before he was charged. And so, of course, when we got the case, we were really concerned with that charge and the confession that was, we think, coerced out of Lehman with regard to that murder. But as we started to dig deeper and pull back the layers, we saw the injustices that were inflicted upon him by the mental health system in Louisiana and by the criminal justice system in Louisiana.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to mention, too, just for clarity, young, poor black man in the South, murderer of a rich white woman that had been unsolved for 2 years. I'm willing to bet the cops then were looking for a scapegoat, and who could be more defenseless than a young black man in America?
Well, that was our theory. We found that the officers in that area, there was an election coming up. Mm-hmm. So they needed something good. They had also recently lost a case in Shreveport regarding the desegregation of bus terminals. So the officers there were getting a lot of bad press, and they needed something good. And this woman was a well-known woman. She was described as a socialite in the newspapers at that time, and so they needed something that would help them win. And even Lehman, in interviews that he had with some healthcare professionals, he said the officers told him they needed to solve this case because they had an election coming up. And he also told some of his psychiatrists that he only knew what to say in the confession because of what he saw on television and what he read in the newspapers.
Okay, so he maybe was not a very bright person to begin with, but, and I don't mean to be disparaging, but it sounds like he was. That was another mark against her, another thing that made him vulnerable. Before we go on, what time frame are we talking here? What about when was all this happening?
So Miss Booth was murdered in 1960, in December 1960, and he was actually committed in early 1962, and his indictment came in December 1962, so almost exactly 2 years after Miss Booth's murder. And he stayed either within the mental health care system in an institution or in Angola, where he was eventually brought for another murder until his death when he was 60 years old.
Wow. You said in your notes here from your presentation that you found issues with the criminal justice system's treatment of Lehman Howard, such as, it sounds like he was being treated badly enough just by being thrown in jail like this, but, after he was convicted, you said he was committed, so they put him in a mental health facility, or?
Well, let me clarify. He wasn't convicted of the murder of Miss Booth. He was indicted. They had mental health proceedings done to determine if he was competent to stand trial, and they decided not to prosecute him for that murder.
Okay.
But he was placed in back to the mental health facility that he was initially placed in by his father.
Oh.
And instead of being placed there as a mental health committee, he was placed as a criminal mental health committee. So what's called criminal civil commitment. And it's whenever you're committed to a mental health facility because of your dangerousness, combining with the mental health illness that you have makes you dangerous beyond your control. And so that's what brought him to the mental health facility there after the indictment. He went to Angola because of a murder that occurred at the mental health facility that he was charged and convicted of.
Okay.
This occurred a few years after he had been there. We found some evidence that maybe that conviction wasn't necessarily well taken care of, but there's no certainty that we were able to have, on whether the government was right in convicting him or not. But
there are no court records you could find for that, or?
There are some court records. However, they're not very well documented, especially when you have older cases like this. The documents generally are hard to come by, and especially in any civil rights case where you have the government inflicting the harm, it's very hard to come across the documents because generally they're destroyed.
Right.
And in Louisiana specifically, we have a lot of flooding, hurricanes. That leads to destruction of documents that we can't control, you know.
Right.
And so some documents are just hard to come by. With his, we were able to find a little bit of what was used by the state against him, but he was given an attorney, appointed an attorney, and all of those attorneys have now passed away. We don't have any of the information that we could get from them, you know.
Right. Okay, I'd like to remind the listeners, well, I'm talking with Cameron Pontiff and Hayden Carlos regarding some of the work they've done researching civil rights violations of Lehman Howard in our mental health facilities here in Louisiana. Okay, so what were some of the things about the mistreatments committed against him, both in the prison system and in the mental health facility that you found?
Well, it's important to know the individual that he was in contact with, the physician that was in charge of Mr. Howard, and actually in charge of the East Louisiana State Hospital at the time. A man by the name of Dr. Butterworth. He was the individual that was the chief psychiatrist at East Louisiana State Hospital, and we were trying to figure out what his correlation was with Mr. Howard at the time and whether he had anything to do with Mr. Howard's criminal activity and his violence, especially the murder that he committed while in the mental institution. So what we did was look back at his old publications, Dr. Butterworth's old publications, and we found that he, from the outset, already had some unorthodox views when it comes to treatment in the psychiatry. So first off, he would believe that you needed to get outside of the traditional psychotherapy, and then he would also move into things such as possible LSD experimentation. And he actually has a documented publication of him experimenting with 52 patients with LSD. And so we were thinking, since Lehman Howard had firsthand contact with Dr. Butterworth, that he could have been subject to those types of experimentations, because we also interviewed some former inmates from Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola. And what they told me is that Dr. Butterworth also was a psychiatrist at Angola at the time. And he wasn't necessarily the nicest person. They called him a maniac. They said that he was basically well known. He was infamous around Angola. And a lot of them told me that he would prescribe them a medicine known as Prolixin, and that would cause them, it's basically anti-schizophrenic, antipsychotic medication, and what it does is individual told me that it made others like a zombie. Yeah. It would just subdue them, and they would just basically walk around and have no idea what's going on, no matter what ailment afflicted them, that he would prescribe them this. And also it was rumored that he would had quid pro quo with some of the inmates in exchange for illicit drugs. And we also found charges of Dr. Butterworth carrying marijuana, morphine, heroin, and the like on him. So from that, and just our understanding of who this individual is or was, because he's passed away now, we figured that he would mistreat inmates and those mentally ill because he had that type of power in that instance. He was in charge of all the individuals in East Louisiana State Hospital. He was also a psychiatrist in Angola at the time, and because of that, he had unfettered access and control over these individuals. Also, Dr. Butterworth, it's kind of interesting, he was tied into an experiment called UK Ultra, and that is MK Ultra, that was tied to the CIA, and they used LSD as a means of mind control. And since he seems to have been the lead physician in this case and was experimenting on individuals without their consent and trying to see the effects of LSD. So that's kind of what we're thinking, is that from all his activities and what we could find of him, that he possibly had some type of hand in the actions of Lehman Howard and those that are, in like circumstances. Yeah,
now, so you have no actual instances, though, where Lehman Howard was abused? I mean, or just...
What we do know is that when Lehman got to Angola from East Louisiana State Hospital. He was on about a dozen psychoactive or antipsychotic medications. Mm-hmm. Dr. Butterworth cut him off of all of them. And so he was unmedicated when he entered Angola. That was concerning for us immediately, because this is a man who is diagnosed with schizophrenia, who has medication, who's trying to get treatment for that, and this doctor cuts him off of that treatment. So while Lehman is at Angola, because he's cut off of this treatment, he attempts suicide. He slits his wrist and his throat. He attempted suicide. Allegedly, he states, whenever interviewed afterwards, he states that he wanted to go back to East Louisiana State Hospital because he was scared of being killed at Angola. So at East Louisiana State Hospital, he had a reputation for as someone who's called a ward boss. And basically that just meant that he helped out with the ward, and he was a little bit more aggressive with the other patients and was a little bit more controlling. But when he got to Angola, his reputation led a lot of inmates to want to attack him for that.
Right.
And at this time, and still today, there's not a lot of protection that the officers at these prisons give to inmates who may be susceptible to attack. And so those were some of the really big concerns that we had while Lehman was at Angola, was that, one, he wasn't getting treatment for the mental health issues that he had. Two, he was, because of that, a danger to himself and others. And three, he was susceptible to attack at any moment, not only because of his reputation, but because he was vulnerable without his medication, without being able to really be in the right mindset to interact in such a dangerous environment.
Okay, during your presentation, getting back to the larger issue here, you made the statement, I forget which one of you made it, but that Louisiana law is not set up, it's inadequate, I think was the word you used, to take care of these people. How do you mean that? I remember you talked about an issue where people could be committed against their will, and I remember thinking then, I didn't ask you guys during the presentation, but I thought, well, if they can be committed against their will, they can be medicated against their will as well. Is that not valid?
That's correct. So in Louisiana, and generally this is across the entire United States, there's something called civil commitment, involuntary civil commitment. And that is when a civil proceeding is instituted against a person to have them committed to a mental health facility for what the government calls treatment. But, I mean, we don't, Cameron and I agree on this, that we don't see this as treatment, because these hospitals are prisons with the word treatment slapped on the wall. That doesn't make it any less of a prison, you know?
Right.
And so what's dangerous about that is that in Louisiana, anyone can initiate that proceeding. The word in the statute is that any person can initiate or file a petition to have someone have these civil commitment proceedings started against them.
I'm aware of an elderly gentleman whose kids tried to get that done to him so they could get to his inheritance.
Oh, wow.
And he moved out of state to get away from them. You know, and I met him in a different state, and he seemed perfectly fine to me, you know, but anyway, the issue of doctors in our prisons and mental health facilities, is there anything unique about them?
I believe you're talking about those that have their license suspended. Right, because we found out that Dr. Butterworth, he had his license suspended because he had 2 felony charges of possession of cocaine and marijuana. Mm-hmm. And it was eventually reinstated after he served 5 years in prison. But what is known to us is that in a state hospital, under the supervision of a licensed physician, an individual is able to practice medicine. And, you know, in a state facility. So that could be Angola, that could be a state hospital. And that, to us, is kind of worrisome for the simple fact that these individuals no longer are competent enough to have their license continued, and they're continuing to practice on individuals, and we're not sure exactly what they're doing with these individuals.
Yes, and in fact, I found, to get ready for this interview, I found an article from the Times-Picayune from back in 2012 by Cindy Chang, where she writes, she opens up with, of the 15 doctors working full-time at Louisiana state prisons, nearly two-thirds have been disciplined by the state medical board for issues ranging from pedophilia to substance abuse to dealing methamphetamines. And the article goes on to state that 60% of the state's prison doctors have disciplinary records, compared with 2% of the state's 16,000 or so licensed medical doctors. And somebody else later in the interview, or in this article here, stated that basically our prison systems and mental health institutions are dumping grounds, or they're places for doctors who can't get a private practice because of criminal convictions and the like. So they're hired by the state.
Right. They're basically a bunch of misfits that are just thrown into our state system to allow them to practice medicine of some sort, if you can call it that at that point.
Right.
And it kind of speaks to the fact that the mental health system in Louisiana and the penal system are just pipelines into each other. As Hayden was saying, you could slap treatment on a wall, but it's still a prison.
Right.
And it's and both are receiving inadequate treatment and just being drugged up at this point. So of course you can understand that people that are supposed to be helping these individuals are really just unlicensed people with no ethics.
And according to someone that we spoke to, a very high official in the criminal justice system here in Louisiana, they're telling us that the mental health treatment that you can receive at a place like Angola is going to be better than what you receive at Louisiana state hospitals that are there for those who are civilly committed.
Did you say why?
Not specifically, but the requirements that are the safeguards that are placed in a prison are different than the safeguards that are placed for people in those mental health facilities.
I'm wondering if that's because simply the prison system is a higher profile institution, whereas people tend to low-key mental health. It just doesn't get the press that the prisons do, so the prisons have to have a higher standard, I guess, is probably what it is.
Right, and that's not just with regard to prisons, but when you look at the criminal justice system compared to civil commitment, the safeguards in the criminal justice systems are heightened. Like you have your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In a civil commitment proceeding, you don't have that right.
Right, you're not competent by basically is what you're declared not competent. So
there's actually a Supreme Court case. It's Kansas versus Hendricks, where a gentleman, a big part of what got him committed to a mental health facility in Kansas was his own testimony, which wouldn't happen if it was a criminal proceeding.
Right.
But when in these civil cases, you don't have the same protections.
Right.
And so although in Louisiana we guarantee the right to counsel in those proceedings, the Constitution doesn't require that. And so if they wanted to, if the body politic decided that that's not necessary anymore, they could get rid of it. That's a concern for us. That's dangerous because in criminal proceedings, that's guaranteed by Gideon versus Wainwright.
But how would we get around that, though? If a person really is incompetent, how would we give them those protections?
And that's the point. Because it's a civil scheme, they don't have those constitutional safeguards to right to counsel, Fifth Amendment right, etc., to where they can go and get a public defender. Because most of these individuals are low income, have some type of mental illness, of course, and like Lehman Howard, he had an IQ of 75.
Okay.
And so these individuals, they don't have the resources or the capabilities to adequately defend themselves against the state's unfettered resources, and that's the issue.
Yeah, and it seems to me that, convicted criminals are vulnerable enough to the system, but people who are mentally ill are even more vulnerable, so the state has a more compelling obligation to provide extra protection to those people when in fact they don't, apparently.
Right, and it's interesting because there's a case called Romeo versus Youngsburg. It's a Supreme Court case, and the court states that a state is not obligated to provide or effectuate any type of treatment because of the lack of science, the lack of rigid science when it comes to mental illness. Now, for example, sex offenders. The state's not quite sure how to properly address their mental illness.
Right.
So they're really just have to lock them up in these institutions and dose them up with some type of medication, and that's all they could possibly do. So that's another problem, is that the state has no idea what to do and how to handle these people, and they're not obligated to do so.
Right, great. And it also, I think, creates opportunities. I guess I'm asking you, it creates opportunities for abuse by other government institutions. You mentioned earlier about the experiments being done in what was
Angola.
I guess Angola. Um,
With are you speaking with regard to MK Ultra?
yes.
Okay,
Okay.
that was actually across the country.
Right.
There were different places all over the country. Tulane University Medical Center was a big contractor of that experiment, and Dr. Butterworth was an associate professor there, or associate doctor there. Sorry. So we believe that's how he kind of got tied into this,
Right.
and started working with that.
Are you guys familiar with a name W.C. Vesh? Have you encountered that name?
It sounds familiar.
I think he
I
was
think-
in. Go ahead.
I think that name came up in one of the documents in our research. I'm sure.
I'm looking at a briefing book that I found looking for information on Dr. Butterworth, and it's written by this W.C. Vesh. And Vesh also wrote a tell-all book that he had said later on put him in fear of being, locked up or put into this situation because he was working with Tulane with these experiments, and he let it be known that he was going to write a book that was going to blow it all up. And I found a little thing about Dr. Butterworth in here about his wife. This is from Mr. Vesh.
Right.
But it says here that while at Charity, which is a hospital, one of the patients locked down was Amy Butterworth. She explained that her husband, Dr. Al Butterworth, was the chief of staff at East Louisiana State Hospital, and whenever she was disobedient, he had her arrested and drugged and shocked into submission.
We did come across that article,
Okay.
and we were like, whoa, this is really similar to what we're researching in our theories, which
Yep.
is interesting.
And she was considered a sensitive person because at one time Dr. Butterworth worked with the U.S. government on LSD experiments, and Amy's job was LSD technician, but she formerly worked for Sandoz Laboratories, who invented LSD. So, basically the article says that he was keeping her drugged up as a play toy, but he was still, they were still controlling her because she could blow the whistle too.
Right.
And all this is going on now, as far as you know?
As far as we know,
Not so much the LSD experiments, but, all this lack of control and the abuse.
yes. Even the other day, I was reading an article. A few Angola officers were fired because they were trading drugs for sexual favors with some of the inmates, and so that speaks to what goes on in Angola. But it's hard to find definitive evidence of these kinds of violations. Like I was saying earlier, when the government does something that violates a person's civil rights, especially in an institution that needs protection. Mental health facilities, they need the protections that we get from like HIPAA protecting patient records.
Right.
Those need protection because that's sensitive information. However, the government can use some of that protection to keep advocates away from finding abuse of their clients or of anybody. That was a problem that we ran into with Lehman, was a lot of his medical records we couldn't get a hold of. And luckily, we were able to get a hold of some just on accident, basically, asking for it and then receiving it and then getting told later, oh, maybe you shouldn't have seen that. Well, that was good for us because we were able to see what was going on with Lehman despite those protections. And it's really hard in these older cases. I mean, Lehman has only 3 surviving siblings, and two of his siblings are in a hospital. They're old. They're much older, and so it's hard to talk to them. And his closest sibling, I was able to contact her, but that was such a long time ago. What happened to him, and she doesn't remember much.
Right.
And also and back at this time, when someone was getting instituted into this kind of facility, generally the family didn't have much contact after that.
Great. Well, I wish we had more time, and maybe in the future we can do another interview or something, at your convenience, of course. I've been listening to, you've been listening to Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought, and I've been talking with Cameron Pontiff and Hayden Carlos from Southern University Law Center regarding the research they did into the treatment of inmates and patients in Louisiana's mental health system and prisons, and basically the abuses of mentally ill people. But we thank you for listening. I thank you, Cameron and Hayden.
Thank you
and
for having
we got to
us.
go.
Thank you.